Most men find out their marriage is over when they are served with divorce papers, usually across a solicitor's desk, accompanied by the cold, sterile reality of asset distribution. I, however, found out in the quiet, dusty confines of my own basement, and by the time I truly understood what was happening, my name had already been inscribed upon a trail of wreckage I had never once touched. My name is Lewis Jackson. I am 51 years old, and I have spent the better part of my adult life building a quiet, respectable existence in a 3-bedroom house in the leafy, tranquil suburb of Glen Iris, Melbourne. I coach youth soccer on Saturday mornings. I manage complex construction projects with a steady hand. And until 11 days ago, I genuinely believed I was one of the luckier men alive. I want you to understand the life I thought I was living. I have been married to Claire and Jackson for 15 years, together for 18 in total. Claire is, or was, the kind of woman who moved through the world with a deliberate, curated grace. She likes lavender-scented candles. She listens to true crime podcasts with an intensity that I once mistook for intellectual curiosity, and she takes her morning coffee with exactly 1 sugar and a splash of oat milk. I know these things. I know the rhythm of her breathing when she sleeps, the specific way she organizes the pantry, and the exact tone of voice she uses when she is pleased. I know this woman, or at the very least, I believed I did. I have spent 18 years looking at Claire and seeing a mirror of my own contentment. We were a fixture of the neighborhood, the couple whose home was the site of many a quiet Sunday afternoon gathering. There were never any great, explosive arguments, no dramatic betrayals that would have alerted me to a shift in the tectonic plates of our domestic life. Looking back, the absence of friction should have been a red flag. A long marriage without a single point of contention is not necessarily a sign of harmony. It could be a sign of a performance so seamless that the audience forgets they're watching a play. I was 51, comfortable in the trajectory of my life, and entirely unprepared for the moment the foundation began to crack. There is a specific kind of arrogance that comes with middle age, a belief that you have finally mastered the variables of your own existence. I was convinced that I had navigated the pitfalls of adulthood and had secured a future that was predictable, stable, and entirely my own. I did not realize that while I was busy tending to the garden and coaching the kids on the pitch, someone else had been meticulously redesigning the very house I lived in, brick by brick, lie by lie. I thought I was the protagonist of a long, happy story. It turned out I was merely a prop in a drama I had no idea was being staged. Part 2. The sound of metal, the catalyst for my awakening, was entirely mundane. A Tuesday in February, that month of gray skies and biting winds that seems to test the resolve of everyone in Melbourne. Claire had been away for 3 days, visiting an old friend on the Gold Coast. I was enjoying a rare stretch of solitary domesticity, eating simple meals, watching sport on the big screen, and indulging in the quiet freedom of a house that belonged entirely to me. It was a peaceful interlude, or so I believed, until the furnace in the basement began to make a sound. It was not a normal mechanical groan, nor the familiar, rhythmic clicking one expects from a heating system straining against the chill of a Melbourne winter. This was something darker, a low, grinding, rhythmic noise, as if something metallic were chewing on something it had no right to consume. Concerned about the potential for a fire or a costly breakdown, I turned to the internet and summoned the first HVAC specialist I could find. 40 minutes later, Dale Briggs, a man with a thick mustache and the faint, reassuring scent of coffee and motor oil, arrived at my door. He was a professional, the kind of man who didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Give me 20 minutes," he said, and I watched him descend into the basement. I retreated to the kitchen, preparing a quick sandwich and settling in to watch a highlight reel. The world felt perfectly normal, until my phone buzzed with a text message from Dale, who was, by all accounts, standing 10 feet beneath my feet. "Mr. Jackson," the message read, "there's a locked door behind your storage shelves. Who is inside?" I laughed. It was an instinctive, dismissive reaction. I typed back, "Dale, buddy, we don't have a locked door back there." There was a pause, marked by the 3 dancing dots that signify a human being struggling to articulate the impossible. Then another message, "Sir, I can't hear breathing inside, and there are 4 heavy-duty padlocks on the outside. The sandwich stopped halfway to my mouth. I want you to understand the gravity of that detail, because I didn't fully process it at the moment. Padlocks on the outside of a door do not serve as a security measure to keep intruders at bay. They are a declaration of intent. They exist to keep whatever is inside trapped. I was down those basement stairs in less than 10 seconds, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. Dale stood in front of our old, heavy-duty metal storage shelves, the very ones Claire had insisted we keep despite my repeated suggestions to donate them, and he had pulled them slightly away from the concrete wall. Behind them stood a door I had not known existed in 15 years of living in that house. It was a plain, hollow-core door, painted the exact shade of gray as the basement walls, hidden so expertly that even if one had known where to look, it would have been invisible. And there, as Dale had promised, were 4 heavy-duty padlocks, each secured on a separate hasp. From behind the wood, faint but unmistakable, came the slow, rhythmic sound of human breathing. In that damp, dimly lit basement, the life I had curated with such care began to unravel, revealing the hidden architecture of a secret I had been living alongside, entirely unaware. The door to the bedroom closed with a quiet, deliberate click, not a slam, which would have at least implied a flicker of emotion, but a gentle, final sound, like a book being shut on a subject no longer worth reading. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, the air in the house suddenly feeling thin, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out by the sheer weight of her indifference. For a heartbeat, I was paralyzed by the realization of what had just occurred. My mother was waiting, alone, her heart struggling in the silence of her home, and the woman who had shared my life for over a decade had just prioritized a morning routine over that life. I did not go back up the stairs. I did not beg. Some realizations are so stark that they leave no room for pleading. Instead, I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady with a cold, newfound purpose. I navigated to the contact for Clinton Webb. He lived 4 houses down, a retired electrician who had spent his life wiring the city and his retirement fixing anything he could get his hands on. He was 71, a man who still believed in the sanctity of a firm handshake and the quiet necessity of showing up for one's neighbors. He picked up on the first ring. Wes. His voice was gruff, grounded, and immediately present. "What's up, brother?" "Clinton, I need a favor," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of my own internal turbulence. "My mother is having chest pains. My truck is at the shop, and Claire's car isn't available. Can you take us to the Royal Prince Alfred?" There was no pause. There was no internal negotiation, no weighing of schedules, no inquiry about his own convenience. There was only the sound of a man moving. "Give me 4 minutes," Clinton said. "I'll pull up in front. Don't worry about a thing." That was it. No conditions. No excuses. Just the quiet, unshakable reliability of a man who understood the fundamental requirements of being a human being. I hung up and immediately dialed my mother. "I'm coming, Mom," I said, my voice firm, stripping away any uncertainty so she wouldn't have to carry the burden of her own fear. "Clinton is driving. You don't need to do a thing. Just unlock the front door, sit down on the sofa, and keep breathing. Do you hear me? Just sit." "Wesley," she whispered, her voice fragile, yet still carrying that inherent, lifelong tendency to apologize for her own existence. "I really don't want to be a burden." "Mom, stop," I said, the gravity of my words grounding the conversation. "You are not a burden. Just sit." I walked out the front door, leaving the house behind me. As I stepped onto the pavement, the cool morning air of Melbourne hit my face, sharp and bracing. I checked my watch. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, Clinton's well-worn sedan pulled up to the curb. He didn't say a word as I climbed in, his eyes meeting mine for a brief, communicative second that said more than 1,000 empty promises. He saw the tension in my jaw, the rigidity of my posture, and he simply put the car in gear. As we drove toward the hospital, I looked out at the familiar streets of the suburb, the trees passing by in a blur. I felt 2 distinct sensations warring within me, an overwhelming, aching gratitude for the man sitting beside me, and a cold, silent void where my feelings for my wife had once resided. I hadn't processed the betrayal yet. I had simply shelved it, tucking it away to be examined only after I knew my mother was safe. For now, there was only the mission, the road, and the stark, illuminating difference between those who talk about love and those who prove it. The drive to the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital felt like a descent into a world where time had suspended all its normal rules. Melbourne's morning traffic, usually a chaotic rhythm of commuters and sirens, seemed to blur into a monochromatic streak beyond the windows of Clinton's sedan. My mother sat in the back seat, her small frame swallowed by the upholstery, clutching her handbag with both hands as if it were an anchor keeping her tethered to the world. She wore her best blue coat, the one she reserved for Sunday services or special occasions, as if the gravity of the situation demanded a certain level of decorum. It was a detail that broke my heart all over again. Even in the throes of a cardiac event, she was concerned with how she presented herself to the world. We reached the emergency department at 8:27 a.m. The air inside the hospital was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the muted, frantic energy of people caught in the machinery of health and illness. A nurse named Beverly, a woman with broad shoulders and eyes that had clearly witnessed the entire spectrum of human fragility, met us at the intake desk. She did not waste time with pleasantries or bureaucratic delays. Within 15 minutes, my mother was in a private room, the rhythmic beep-beep-beep of a cardiac monitor becoming the heartbeat of our morning. The attending physician, Dr. Raymond Cole, arrived shortly after. He was a man of deliberate movements, his voice a calm, resonant bass that seemed designed to lower the blood pressure of everyone in the room. He walked my mother through the procedure, explaining the EKG and the enzyme tests with a patience that felt like a luxury. As he finished his assessment, my mother's eyes, bright but weary, flickered toward me. She was not looking for a doctor. She was looking for her son. She needed to know if the situation was as dire as her body suggested. "Do whatever he says, Mum," I said, my voice steady, though every muscle in my body was coiled with the effort of remaining composed. She nodded slowly, then reached up, her hand trembling slightly as she touched my face. Her skin felt like parchment, papery and thin, but her touch was as firm as a vow. "You came," she said, the two words falling into the room like stones into a still pond. There was a profound, aching vulnerability in her tone, the realization that she had been uncertain if I would arrive. That simple acknowledgement was almost my undoing. It was a mirror held up to the reality of my life. The woman who had spent 5 decades ensuring I never felt abandoned was suddenly shocked that I had arrived when she was in need. "Mum, I will always come," I promised, pressing my cheek against her knuckles. She patted my face twice, a familiar, motherly gesture that echoed from my childhood, before closing her eyes and leaning back against the sterile white pillow. I was ushered out shortly after, directed toward the waiting room. For the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, I existed in the purgatory of the hospital corridor. The lighting was an unforgiving, artificial yellow that made everyone look hollowed out. A television in the corner played a morning talk show on mute, the vibrant colors of the studio set clashing with the somber reality of the ER. I drank a cup of coffee from a machine near the lift, a bitter, lukewarm sludge, and found I could not taste a single thing. During that time, I checked my phone every few minutes. The screen remained dark. There were no messages from Claire. Not a single, "How is she?" or "Are you okay?" Her silence was not a void. It was a loud, declarative statement. Sitting on that plastic chair, amidst the hum of machines and the whispers of other families in distress, the distance between my home and this hospital room felt infinite. I was not just waiting for test results. I was waiting for the final realization to fully take root. The woman who had sworn a lifetime of partnership was nowhere to be found, while the woman who had spent her life preparing me for such moments was fighting for hers just a few walls away. At 11:04 a.m., the heavy double doors of the ward swung open, and Dr. Raymond Cole stepped out. His expression was measured, serious enough to command attention, but devoid of the sharp, jagged alarm that precedes a terminal verdict. I stood up, my joints stiff from hours of motionless waiting, my senses heightened to the point of pain. "Mr. Watson," he began, his voice calm, cutting through the ambient noise of the emergency department. "Your mother has suffered what we classify as a mild cardiac event. It was a clear warning from her body, not a total failure, but it is not something we can dismiss. She is currently stable, and we are moving her to a monitored unit for observation, medication adjustments, and further testing. She is resting, and honestly, she's already asking if there is a television in her room so she can watch the afternoon news." A hollow, genuine laugh escaped my chest, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension I had been carrying. That was Margaret Sullivan to her core. Even with her heart under siege, she was concerned with keeping pace with the world outside. "Can I see her?" I asked, the desperation finally receding, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Give my team 20 minutes to settle her," Dr. Cole replied with a sympathetic nod before turning back to his duties. I sank back into the molded plastic chair, but the relief I felt was strangely tainted. I leaned my elbows on my knees and stared at the linoleum floor, tracing the scuffs and patterns of a life lived in transit. The silence of the waiting room no longer felt heavy. It felt clarifying. It provided the space I had been denied for years, the space to think without the constant background noise of someone else's expectations. I pulled out my phone, the screen still stubbornly blank. Not a single message. Not one inquiry about my well-being or my mother's, or how I was handling the prospect of losing the woman who had built the foundation of my entire life. The realization that had been simmering in the back of my mind since that morning now boiled over. I thought about the social commitments Claire had prioritized, the orchestrated grace of a life lived for appearance. And I thought about my mother, lying in a sterile hospital bed, her heart fluttering like a bird trapped in a cage. I began to see the reality of my marriage for what it truly was. I thought about the Sunday dinners I had hosted, where I had spent hours preparing, ensuring everything was perfect, only for Claire to be distracted by her phone or her plans. I realized that my attempts to keep the peace had never actually been about creating peace. They had been about managing her discontent. I had been a peacekeeper in a war of one. I looked at the phone again. It was a tool of connection, yet in my hands, it was a testament to the chasm between us. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the sprawling, vibrant skyline of Melbourne. The city looked indifferent to my small, private tragedy. I felt a cold, sharp, and final resolution settle into my marrow. The man who had stood at the bottom of those stairs that morning, paralyzed by the fear of her displeasure, was beginning to dissolve. In his place, there was a man who saw the truth for the first time. He had not been a husband to a partner, but a witness to an indifference that had long ago replaced any affection. I closed my eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and for the first time in over a decade, I didn't feel the need to justify anything. The clarity was not a burden, it was a release. I was finally ready to face the aftermath of a decision I hadn't yet made, but which had already become inevitable. I remained with Mom until 4 in the afternoon. The hours passed in a quiet, steady rhythm, the kind of stillness that only exists between two people who have loved each other long enough to move beyond the need for constant conversation. She was sharp, her wit flickering to life as she beat me twice at a makeshift word game she invented, using hospital equipment and Australian state capitals as our prompts. She was more alert than I had been on my best days, a testament to a mind that refused to surrender to the fragility of her body. At 3:47 p.m., just as the afternoon light began to soften against the hospital window, casting long, golden shadows across the linoleum, she reached out and took my hand. Her voice underwent a subtle, profound shift. The thin, airy quality of the morning had vanished, replaced by a resonance that carried the weight of years. "Wesley," she said, and I knew before she spoke another syllable that the trajectory of our lives was about to alter. "I'm here, Mom," I replied, my own voice dropping to match her solemnity. She looked at me, her eyes as clear as the coastal waters near the Mornington Peninsula. "Claire didn't come, did she?" It was not a question meant to elicit information, but rather a statement of fact that had already been processed and filed away. I did not answer immediately. I thought about the social obligations and the seamless way she had excused herself from the emergency. She had prior commitments, Mum, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Just your name, she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips, not of malice, but of deep, weary understanding. She looked toward the window, her gaze tracking a lone bird as it traced an arc against the Melbourne skyline. You do not need to shield me from the truth, Wesley. I have seen the world long enough to know when someone is merely passing through it, and when someone is actually living in it. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a critique of Claire, nor did she lament the situation. She simply accepted it with a dignity that was more devastating than any outburst could have been. She reached for the bedside table, her movements slow but deliberate, and pulled a small, folded piece of paper from her glasses case. It was a phone number written in her elegant, practiced handwriting, a document she had clearly kept for a moment just like this. I wanted to call Paul Logan, she said, her tone absolute. Mr. Paul Logan, the attorney who handled your father's estate. I need to speak with him, and I need you to be present. I looked at her, stunned by the precision of her resolve. This was not an impulsive reaction to a moment of illness. This was the culmination of a long-standing observation. Mum, you do not have to do this, I began, but she silenced me with a single, sharp look, the same look she had used to keep me on the straight and narrow when I was a teenager. Wesley Andrew Watson, she said, using my full name with a command that brooked no argument. Do not finish that sentence. I have spent my entire life building a legacy with your father. We scrimped, we saved, and we sacrificed so that what we left behind would mean something to someone who understood the value of effort. I have earned the right to decide where that life's work goes. And I have decided. She turned her gaze back to the window, the golden hour light illuminating her profile. She looked younger, somehow, or perhaps she simply looked exactly like herself. The woman who had raised me, supported me, and never once asked for a return on her investment of love. The hospital room felt small, yet it contained the weight of a monumental decision. She was not acting out of anger. She was acting out of an unwavering commitment to the truth. And as I looked at her, I realized that for the first time in years, I was not afraid. I was simply a witness to the profound, inevitable consequences of a life lived with integrity and a life lived without it. At 2 p.m. sharp, Mr. Paul Logan arrived. He was a man who moved with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 3 decades navigating the complexities of human legacies. Clad in a charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked as though it had witnessed 1,000 life-altering conversations, he greeted me with a firm, respectful nod before, turning his full attention to my mother. I retreated to the corner of the room, folding myself into the visitor's chair. I was a witness now, a silent participant in the final chapter of a story I had long been a part of, yet had never fully understood until this day. The consultation lasted 47 minutes. It was a study in precision. Mr. Logan did not offer hollow platitudes. He listened with an intensity that made the sterile air of the hospital room feel electric. As he clicked his pen and spread his legal pad across his knees, the gravity of the moment settled over us. Piece by piece, the structure of my mother's life, the life she and my father had spent over 3 decades meticulously building, was being reorganized. The house on the quiet, tree-lined street in Northbridge, which she had owned outright for years, was the first cornerstone of the discussion. Then came the investment accounts, the accumulation of years of careful living, and the personal effects that carried the resonance of our history. My attention drifted to the 1967 Holden, that beautiful mechanical masterpiece my father had restored with his own hands. It lived under a custom cover in her garage, a machine that still smelled of his workshop on warm afternoons. Every item, every asset, was being reassigned with a focus that was both clinical and profoundly loving. There was a specific, deliberate silence whenever the subject of the future was raised. I watched as Mr. Logan noted the details, his hand moving across the paper with rhythmic purpose. What struck me most was what was not being said. There was no mention of Claire. There was no debate about fairness or obligation. My mother was simply reclaiming the right to place her life's work in the hands of someone who would respect the provenance of it all. It was an act of restoration, a way of ensuring that the values my father had stood for would not be diluted by those who had never known the weight of earning them. Finally, she added a provision that surprised me. $20,000, earmarked specifically for a local animal welfare organization where she had volunteered every third Saturday for over a decade. Even in her redirection of the estate, she remained the woman who found joy in the quiet, necessary acts of kindness. When Mr. Logan finally clicked his pen shut and tucked the documents into his briefcase, the room felt lighter, as if a great, lingering tension had been resolved. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and looked toward my mother. She had already returned to her crossword puzzle, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, her demeanor once again one of complete, unbothered grace. "Mrs. Watson," Mr. Logan said, his voice carrying a rare note of genuine admiration. "You are, without question, the most clear-eyed person I have had the privilege of representing in my 30 years of practice." My mother did not look up from her puzzle, though a small, satisfied smile played at the corner of her lips. "I have had a long time to think about it, Paul," she said simply, "and I have learned that the truth is rarely as complicated as people try to make it." As I walked him to the door, he paused and caught my eye. "Your mother knows exactly what she is doing," he whispered. I did not need him to tell me. I looked back at her. My mother, the woman who had packed my lunches, sat through the coastal winds at rugby games, and made Sunday dinners for anyone who needed a seat. And I realized that for the first time, I finally understood what she had been trying to teach me all along. You do not build a life to be consumed by the indifferent. You build it to be honored by those who understand the cost of the foundation. I left the hospital at 4:30 p.m., the afternoon air already beginning to carry the cool, crisp promise of a Sydney evening. Clinton was waiting by the sedan, his posture as relaxed as ever. He did not ask a barrage of intrusive questions. He simply observed the way I carried myself, his eyes noting the shift in my demeanor. When I climbed in, he did not even need to ask if everything had been resolved. He saw it in the set of my shoulders and the quietness of my breathing. We drove back toward the house in a companionable silence, the kind that exists only between two men who understand that sometimes the most profound communication happens in the absence of words. The return to the white colonial house at the end of the street felt like an arrival at a sanctuary. It was the place where I had learned to navigate the world, where my father had laid the literal and metaphorical bricks of our family life, and where every corner held the ghost of a lesson learned or a milestone achieved. The porch was swept clean, and the welcome mat, though faded by years of sun and rain, still held a dignity that the expensive, manicured entryways of my own home lacked. Inside, the house smelled of chamomile and the enduring, subtle scent of cedarwood. I moved through the rooms with a sense of purpose I had not felt in years. I prepared Mum's tea, steeping the bag for exactly 4 minutes, just as she had instructed when I was a boy, and moved through the medical regimen Dr. Cole had prescribed, reading the labels aloud to ensure she understood the transition to her new, necessary routine. Mum sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the warm porcelain of her mug, watching me with a gaze that was both loving and profoundly penetrating. This was the same table where she had helped me with algebra, where she had folded the laundry while listening to the radio, and where, 12 years ago, we had sat in the crushing silence of the morning after my father's death, holding hands in a communion of shared grief. "Sit down, Wesley," she said, her voice soft but carrying the resonance of a command. I pulled out the chair and sat. She reached across the polished wood, covering my hand with her own. Her skin was warm, the touch of a mother who had never wavered in her role as the anchor of my existence. "I need you to hear me," she said, her eyes locked onto mine. "What I did today with the will, I did not do it to punish Claire. I did not do it out of a desire for retribution. I did it because it was right. Your father and I built a life on the premise of mutual investment. We understood that a legacy is not a gift to be squandered, but a trust to be managed by someone who understands what it actually takes to build something together. You understand that, Wesley. You always have. She paused, her thumb tracing the back of my hand. I need you to think about your life, not about the money, and certainly not about the estate. I need you to think about your own happiness. You have been showing up alone for a very long time, my dear. A man of your character, a man who understands the sanctity of showing up, deserves someone who stands beside him, not someone who expects him to carry the burden of the partnership while they remain perpetually detached. The kitchen was perfectly, beautifully still. The hum of the refrigerator felt like the heartbeat of the house, grounding us in a world that was suddenly stripped of its pretenses. Her words were not a critique. They were a mirror. Every syllable she spoke was a cold, hard truth I had spent 11 years refusing to acknowledge. My throat tightened, and for a moment, the room blurred, but I did not look away. "I know, Mom," I said, my voice rough with the realization of all the years I had spent enduring rather than living. She nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled her acceptance of my understanding. She patted my hand twice, a gesture that had signaled comfort for over half a century, and released it. "Good," she said, picking up her tea and taking a calm, measured sip. "Now, are you going to check your phone, or are you going to let it buzz its way into oblivion?" I looked at the device on the table, which had been vibrating incessantly for the better part of the hour. Claire was calling again. I turned it face down on the wooden surface, the muffled sound of the vibration echoing in the quiet room. "Not yet," I said. Mum's mouth curved into a faint, knowing smile. She did not press. She did not advise. She simply leaned back, satisfied that for the first time in a decade, her son was finally listening to himself. Part 9. The Anatomy of a Confession. 19 days of playing the role of the devoted husband had left me with a strange, hollow efficiency. I was Lewis Jackson, the man who coached youth soccer, managed construction schedules, and dutifully ignored the creeping suspicion that my life was being dismantled from within. On that Thursday evening, when Renee Gallagher arrived at our home in Glen Irisford, one of their long, ritualistic visits, I set my plan into motion. I told Claire I was heading to Gary's to discuss some work matters, kissed her cheek with a practiced, neutral affection, and drove exactly 4 blocks away. I parked in the shadows of a quiet street and opened my laptop, pulling up the audio feed from the hidden monitor in the sunroom. At first, there was only the mundane static of friendship, talk of work, a cousin's upcoming wedding, and the latest restaurant trends in the city. I almost convinced myself that I was being cruel, that I had planted a listening device in my own sunroom based on paranoia and the bitter instincts of a man who had lost his way. Then, the cadence of the conversation shifted. The warmth vanished from Claire's voice, not with a bang, but with a clinical, chilling precision, the way one might extinguish a flame by cutting off its oxygen. "He has no idea," Claire said, her voice devoid of its usual performative softness. Renee was quiet for a moment, the tension palpable even through the digital feed. "You are certain? He is walking around, making me coffee in the mornings and acting like the man I have known for 18 years. He is exactly who he has always been," Claire replied, a hint of genuine amusement dancing on her tongue. "He cannot see past the surface of things. He never could. That is why he was the perfect candidate." "And the woman? Angela?" Renee asked. "Safe," Claire said. "She agreed to disappear for 60 days. I paid her well enough that she will not speak. She is tucked away in a quiet hotel in Perth. By the time the 60 days are up, Lewis will be too buried under the weight of his own crimes to matter." There was a pause, followed by the soft clink of a glass against the coffee table. "Claire," Renee murmured, her voice laced with a sudden, sharp uncertainty. "What happens to him actually happens when the police find the final piece. He becomes the answer to a question they're already asking," Claire said simply. "They have his name, his fingerprints, his financial trail. I just had to let the structure build itself. It has its own gravity now. Another few weeks, and it will not need me anymore." "And you?" Renee asked. "Somewhere warm, Claire said, and then she laughed, an easy, relaxed, and genuinely amused sound. It was the laugh of someone who had just solved an intricate puzzle and found the result perfectly satisfactory. I sat in my parked car, the cool air of the Melbourne night seeping through the window, listening to my wife laugh about the architecture of my destruction. I did not feel rage. The fire of anger had long since burned out, leaving only a cold, crystalline resolve. I closed the laptop, my fingers steady as I tucked it away. I did not call Dennis, and I did not call Gary. I finally understood the full scope of what I was up against. She had not just studied me. She had become fluent in every weakness I possessed. But she had made one critical, irreversible mistake. She had underestimated the strength of the foundation I had spent 50 years building, and she had mistaken my silence for defeat. Part 10. The evidence of truth. 2 days after Renee's visit, I engaged Carl Upton, a retired investigator with a reputation for being as methodical as he was discreet. My instruction to him was singular and absolute: find Angela Pruitt. It took Carl 6 days. She was in Perth, exactly as Claire had orchestrated, staying in a mid-range hotel on the outskirts of the city, using a slightly altered name. Carl did not just locate her. He captured the reality of the situation. He secured photographs of her, obtained a notarized statement, and got her on record regarding every detail of Claire's manipulation. Angela Pruitt was not a criminal. She was a woman in a moment of profound desperation who had made a catastrophic choice. When Carl sat across from her in that hotel lobby, explaining the legal definition of being an accessory to a crime, the veneer of her compliance shattered. She gave us everything: how Claire had approached her, the amount she had been paid, and the specific script she had been coached to follow. She signed the statement with shaking hands, her tears finally mirroring the genuine gravity of her predicament. Carl sat with her until she composed herself, then sent me the digital files, the most damning evidence I could have ever hoped to possess. I now held 2 pieces of evidence that Claire did not know existed: the recorded conversation from the sunroom and the signed statement from the woman who was supposed to be my silent accuser. I had the means to dismantle her narrative, but I chose not to walk into the local station and hand them over immediately. I knew that in the eyes of the law, evidence presented by a person already under suspicion, even if exonerating, becomes part of a long, grinding public process during which Claire would undoubtedly build a new defensive wall. She was an expert at dismantling. I knew that now. Instead, I opted for a more precise, singular act of psychological dismantling. On a Friday evening, while Claire sat in the sunroom, immersed in her book, a chilling irony I noted with a detached clinical interest, I sat at the kitchen table and sent 2 files from an untraceable email address to a phone number she used for her private arrangements. I sent the sunroom audio file and a photograph of Angela Pruitt, alive and well, holding that day's newspaper. There was no message, no threat, and no explanation. I simply pressed send, closed the laptop, washed my coffee mug, and went to bed. Claire came downstairs 40 minutes later. Through the slightly open door of our bedroom, I watched her stand in the hallway for an eternity, her phone illuminated in her hand. She remained completely still. In 15 years of marriage, I had never seen Claire and Jackson stand motionless. She was a woman who lived in perpetual motion, always adjusting, managing, and refining the reality around her. Tonight, she stood in the doorway like someone who had just heard a sound they could not locate, a rhythm they could not sync with. It was the first moment of true instability I had ever witnessed in her, and it was deeply satisfying. The final piece was in place. I had shifted the architecture of our marriage, and for the first time, I was the one holding the blueprint. The next morning, with the navy blue folder of evidence tucked firmly under my arm, I drove to Detective Callahan's office, ready to conclude the narrative I had been forced to inhabit. Part 11. The weight of finality. The morning I presented the navy blue folder to Detective Callahan was marked by a sharp, biting cold that seemed to cut through the glass of his office windows. I watched him read. The rustle of paper, the periodic silence of a man absorbing facts that inverted everything he had previously assumed. When he finally looked up, the skeptical, lingering suspicion that had defined our interactions for the past 11 days had vanished, replaced by a grim, professional acknowledgement of the truth. I did not offer a defense, nor did I seek an apology for the months of surveillance. I simply walked out, leaving the weight of the investigation squarely on the shoulders of the person who had engineered it. Claire was arrested the following Tuesday. It was 9 a.m., and the Melbourne air was biting, a gray morning that felt appropriate for the unraveling of a facade. I stood in the doorway of our home in Glen Iris, observing the scene with a detachment that surprised even me. As the officers guided her toward the patrol car, she turned back for one final, lingering look. There was no defiance left, only a hollow sort of confusion, as if she were trying to locate the man who had served as her canvas for so many years. She looked for the familiar, predictable Lewis, the one who would plead, the one who would offer a lifeline, but she found nothing. I offered a simple, single nod, acknowledging not her, but the conclusion of the performance. Watching the patrol car disappear around the corner, I did not feel the surge of triumph I had once imagined would come with vindication. Instead, there was a profound sense of lightness, as if the air had suddenly regained its clarity. I re-entered the house, walking through rooms that were now entirely empty of their intent. I did not linger. I gathered the few personal effects that had been mine long before I met her, the books, the tools, the small mementos of a life lived before the orchestration began, and walked out to my truck. The drive away from Glen Iris felt like waking from a long, feverish dream. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I drove towards Northbridge, where my mother was waiting. The transition was not a return to the past, but an entry into a future I had finally secured for myself. When I pulled up to the house with the faded welcome mat, I felt the sharp, bracing scent of the coast on the wind. This house, with its cedar-scented kitchen and the quiet hum of history, was no longer a place of refuge from a failing marriage. It was a sanctuary of recovery. As I stepped onto the porch, I realized that the life I had lost was never truly mine, but the one I was about to reclaim belonged to me in its entirety. I had spent 15 years being a footnote in someone else's carefully constructed narrative. Now, standing on the threshold of my own home, the silence did not feel heavy or suffocating. It was filled with the promise of a morning that would be determined by my own choices, not by the manipulations of another. I was a man of 51 years, starting again, not from the beginning, but from the vantage point of a hard-won truth. The folder was gone, the police were involved, and the woman who had sought to build her architecture upon my life was finally facing the ruin of her own design. I opened the door, and for the first time in 18 years, I did not need to prepare a response to an unspoken question. I was simply home. Part 12. The architecture of peace. Looking back at the path that led me here, I realized that the most difficult part of the journey was not the initial betrayal, but the agonizing process of unlearning the person I had become to accommodate it. For years, I had constructed a version of myself that was palatable, compliant, and perpetually silent. I had traded my authenticity for the illusion of domestic harmony, believing that if I simply held the frame steady enough, the picture of our marriage would eventually align. But I learned the hard way that you cannot build a life on the shifting sands of another person's deception. You must build it on the bedrock of your own truth. In the quiet of these past few months, I have found that peace is not merely the absence of conflict. It is the presence of clarity. My life is smaller now, in many ways. It is quieter, devoid of the social obligations and the performative perfection that once defined my days in Glen Iris. But it is also infinitely deeper. I have regained the ability to listen to my own intuition, a faculty I had allowed to atrophy during those long, lonely years in a house that was never truly mine. Every morning, as I watch the light move across the kitchen floor in Northbridge, I am reminded that freedom is not an end goal. It is a daily practice. It is the decision to acknowledge that you are responsible for the walls you choose to live within. I think often of the photograph of Angela Pruitt that I found in the back of Claire's book. I wonder where she is now, and if she, like me, has managed to reclaim the fragments of her life. The darkness of that chapter is something I will carry for a time, not as a burden, but as a map. It serves as a reminder of how quickly one can be erased from their own narrative if they are not vigilant. Yet, I refuse to let that experience define the man I am today. I have a responsibility to the future, to the quiet integrity I witnessed in my mother, and to the person I have rediscovered in the aftermath of the storm. On the days when the weight of the past threatens to linger, I go to the garage. I work on the old Holden, the rhythmic sound of the tools against metal acting as a form of meditation. There is a profound honesty in mechanics. If the pieces do not fit, the engine will not turn. It is a lesson I have applied to the architecture of my own life. I am no longer forcing parts together that were never meant to align. I am curating an existence that is honest, sustainable, and entirely congruent with my own values. Tonight, as I sit on the porch and listen to the wind moving through the eucalyptus trees, I feel a sense of completeness that I once thought was reserved for fiction. My brother, Dennis, stopped by earlier, and we sat on the back steps talking about nothing of consequence. The kind of conversation that only occurs between two people who know the worst of each other and love each other anyway. It was simple. It was real. I am 51, and I'm finally beginning. The house is quiet. The tea is warm. And for the first time, I am not waiting for the other shoe to drop. I am simply here, fully present, standing on a solid ground of my own making. I have finally learned the most vital lesson of all. You do not find peace by changing the world around you. You find it by finally becoming the person you were always brave enough to be.